Welcome to The Secret Witch Show, the podcast providing a safe and alchemical altar space of conversations which help powerful women escape a half-hearted, spiritless society and rediscover the freedom of living a wildly magical life. Every other week, we explore how to cast aside the wounds of shame, guilt, and fear connected with fully being yourself, so you can grant yourself permission to stop hiding, ground soulfully back into your body, illuminate your whole soul desires, tend your soul, rediscover and reclaim your powerful gifts, express your magic, and manifest your wildest alchemy. There's no better place to become who your heart longs to be. This is where we will guide you into liberation. I'm your host, Nicole Barton, and I'm so excited to dive in. Welcome, magical ones. I'm so delighted to be here sharing this episode with you today. We've recently birthed our Lunar News, which we magically create each month around full moon to guide you into your own healing medicine woman in alignment with not only the moon, but one of the core foundational archetypal apothecary remedies that we dose in this path. In essence, our newsletter is like we're sending you a remedy to your inbox that energetically doses you with remedies from our toolkit that help you to heal, discover, embody, and dose your wise medicine woman. In other words, to learn to trust your own self-healer and the magical guide your soul came here to be. As part of signing up, you can also receive our 3-day Secret Witch Visioning Challenge. So if you've not already enrolled to receive it and you'd like to, head to www.nicolebarton.co.uk/sign-up. On The Secret Witch Show today, our guest is Veda Austin. Veda is a water researcher, public speaker, mother, artist, and author. She has dedicated the last 8 years to observing and photographing the life of water and believes that water is fluid intelligence, observing itself through every living organism on the planet and in the universe. Her primary area of focus is photographing water in its state of creation, the space between liquid and ice, and her remarkable crystallographic photos are nothing short of amazing. Veda has demonstrated how water responds to our thinking in ways that we would have thought unimaginable. In this episode, we take a deep dive into exploring water science, i.e. how water has a secret fluid intelligence and the implications of that, exploring how we can harness this science and art for deep self-healing. Let's dive in. Veda, welcome. I am so excited for this episode. I can't even tell you how excited I am. Actually, my entire model here in the archetypal apothecary path for Secret Witches has really been created. I was just speaking to you before. It's been created from the lineage of homeopathic philosophy, and so your water experiments really do mean so much for that work. And also magically, I didn't tell you this, just before we sat down to record this, I pulled a card for a client, and it was an elemental card, and it was snow, and I was like, oh, that's perfect. And it said every water crystal is unique like us, and I was like, oh, that's so perfect for what we're just about to go in and discuss. And we also have snow here in the UK, of course, as well as we're recording, so I thought that was very magical. So welcome.
Oh, thank you so much. And you're right. I mean, I spend such a lot of time looking at things that are frozen and water that is frozen. And so it's absolutely perfect. Water crystals and crystallography is right up my alley.
Yes, absolutely. So yeah, we're very excited to have you here. And I would love to, as I always start the show, just invite you to share your own journey with the work that you do. Like, how did you come to do this work, this magical work with water? And yeah, anything that feels aligned for you to share about how you got into it as well, and how you are like really expressing your medicine as well feels pertinent to the conversation that our women would be interested in.
Sure thing. Well, there's kind of a long story and a shorter story. But firstly, I would say that really, we tend not to see ourselves as bodies of water. So the reality of what it is to be alive is that we have always had a relationship with water from the moment of conception, perhaps even before that, to birth, throughout life, and even on into death and beyond. And so our relationship with water is really a very deep relationship with self, because not by volume, but by molecular count, we're 99% water. That means that there are more water molecules in our bodies than stars in the Milky Way. And yet, even when we cut ourselves, we leak. When we cry, we leak. When we go to the bathroom, we leak. When we exercise, we leak. All of these things remind us that we are fluid. But when we look in the mirror with our fourth phase, 99% liquid crystal eye lenses, we just see our bodies as solid. And I always say that if eyes are the windows to the soul, then tears are an expression of spirit. So beyond all of what I do, I've come to realize that I have always, and we have always had relationship with water. But for my work, I was very inspired. I mean, I've been working as a water crystallographer for approximately 9.5 years now, coming up to 10. And I was inspired by three people, two particularly. So the first person so many people know of, because his work was so visual, and pictures speak 1,000 words. And so when we really do see the world through this liquid lens. And so that was Masaru Emoto. And his work through the scientific community really, really wasn't embraced at all. And the reason for that was because he really picked the best photos out of many to display what he was trying to convey. And so scientifically, that's really not embraced. However, it doesn't devalue his work. What his work really meant to a lot of people was it kind of opened the doorway into being able to see themselves as bodies of water, sensitive to information, like thoughts and words and images and all these kinds of things. So that was one person. The second person really was extremely inspiring to me, and he's not so well known, but he's a French microscopic photographer who does work very similar in the similar process to Emoto. His name is Laurent Costa. He has a book called Journey into the Heart of Water. And what he was doing was, in his mind, he did not want to experiment on water. And you know, this is very much in the same way that I work with water. I don't really consider what I'm doing experimenting. It's more engaging in relationship. And so for Laurent, he would just wanted water to just share whatever it wanted. And so when he sometimes would look into the water and then take a little bit and flash freeze it, he was photographing happy faces in the water, reflecting back at him. He was seeing hearts, he was seeing fish, all these different kinds of things he would see that were relative to him, that perhaps had happened during his day, something he'd seen, or something that he'd seen in the day or in the week even. It was very interesting when you start to talk to him about how he got these images. I ended up becoming friends with him. And the third person is a man by the name of Thomas Hieronymus, who was a radionic engineer. And he made a very curious observation that when he went into a Parisian meat market, he noticed that the freshly placed organs of an animal appeared to be affecting the way the frost froze on the glass behind where they were placed. For example, the heart organ, the frost would freeze into the shape of the heart organ above where it was placed, and the same with the liver organ, and so on and so forth. And his hypothesis was that there seemed to be some kind of life force energy still emanating out of these organs, even though they weren't attached to an animal anymore. And he believed that that life force energy was in the water in the blood, and that each organ has its own sonic signature. And this is a science. A sonic signature is essentially a kind of sound that emanates for each individual organ, relative to each individual organ. And it creates a kind of blueprint within that organ through the waters. And so that that information in the fluid water of the blood, within the blood, was sharing information, as it does, and we can get into that, with the water in the really freezing cold air, which was then frozen into these blueprint shapes and forms. But what inspired me so much was that what we were seeing there was macroscopic. He was seeing these with his naked eye. Even Rudolf Steiner suggests, look at the way that the frost freezes on the butcher's window compared to that of a florist's. And so seeing that he was being able to see this happen without a microscope really inspired me, because all the way back then I didn't have a microscope, but I had a curious mind, and I'd also had a healing journey, a healing experience with a spring water after a very serious car accident. And so I was very curious, like, what made that water so special and different? How could it have healed me and others in the way that it did?
Wow.
And so I was really looking into that, going, oh, what is it about water that's so different and so special? And so I had a glass petri dish from another project I was working on. So I put some of the spring water that helped heal me into this dish. And after looking and reading all about these three people, I projected, actually the idea was that I was going to think of something, project the thought into the water and freeze it in my freezer and see what would happen. It was just very rudimentary. But as I was thinking about what I was going to think about, I noticed there was this little bit of fluff floating around in the water. And I put my hand in to take out the fluff, but I consciously thought, I wonder if my hand will have any impact on the water's quote unquote memory, because I didn't know if that was even a real thing. And so I thought, oh, well, that'll do. And I put it into the freezer with the peas and broccoli and ice cream and all that. And hours later, I came back and I'm like, oh, I have to see what's happening in there. So I pulled it out, held it up to the light, and took a photograph on my iPhone. And that photo has launched 37,000 photos of water responding in an incredibly artistic and intelligent manner. What I saw was an image of a hand that took up half of the dish. The water had used its building blocks of ice to design the most incredibly detailed hand. That wasn't just any old hand, but I inherited my mother's two slightly crooked fingers, the two beside my middle finger. And the image in the hand of the hand in the ice had bent fingers just like mine. Wow. So it was extremely interesting. And that then led on to more and more and more, which led on to an entirely new technique based on the state between molecular chaos and molecular order, which is where all of my work now is done.
Oh my goodness, what a story. It's really fascinating, and I'm wondering where to go to first. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. That was just magical. And I think when you first started talking about water, it kind of blew my mind, actually. It was taking me off to some remedies known as gifts of the mother in the homeopathic world, which very much feels like there's that kind of something greater that you're talking to about water. It kind of just blew my mind the way you described water there, and that relationship with it. So yeah, there's something maybe there to explore, but I think what I heard you were speaking to really was that you were almost like engaging in relationship with the spirit of water. And I don't know if that's necessarily how you describe it, but it's how it felt to me. And it's something, just to speak to what I mean there a little bit more, is that's kind of what I do in my work, is kind of working with the spirits of the homeopathic remedies. So yeah, I don't know if that's how you see it, but it just struck me as very interesting.
It is exactly how I see it. In fact, that's how I talk about it on my workshops and masterclasses. And I just always say, with whatever word you feel most comfortable with, whether that's the energy or the spirit of the plant or whatever the remedy is. Somebody asked me, why I think that the higher dilutions of homeopathy is more potent when it doesn't seem to logically make any sense. But
I love that.
to me, it does logically make sense, because after you study water for so long, I always say the secrets are in the subtleties. And for example, there are over 300 different types of ice. And within every different type of ice, there is, I don't know how many subtleties, probably millions. Water is so anomalous. It's the rebel element. It defies the laws of physics and gravity. It goes upwards in trees and it expands when it cools. It doesn't make sense in so many avenues when you look at them. But when you start looking at water and from the ancient and indigenous perspectives, you see that they have been observing it and watching it for long periods of time. And that's really where you start to understand where real magic is, if you have the patience to observe things for a long time. And so since I've been doing that, and I'll probably be doing it for the rest of my life, I have observed that if you take, for example, I'm trying to decide which way to go with this, the Maori word, my dad is Maori, so the Maori word for spirit is wairua. It means two waters. Essentially, in a very simplified way, it is the physical waters and the spiritual waters. And I believe that we have both within us, and all life forms have both.
It reminds me of the Rumi quote about it not being a drop in the ocean. I can never get this the right way around, but you know the one I mean.
I do.
Yeah.
And so what's interesting, though, I think, is that so often I talk about the spiritual aspect of water as being the observer. So that's one of the reasons that when I did a study on homeopathy, I used spring water. I put the homeopathic drop into spring water, not distilled water. And one of the reasons I did that was because spring water is so much more similar to us. It has the salts and minerals. It's in movement. It's not pure, if you will. And it's always hungry for information. So water is always hungry for information. That's why it's always picking up all of these minerals and salts and various other things. So what's interesting, with distilled water, it's more in a sort of a state of observation, as opposed to an active participant with the ability to observe. And so we are more like active participants, because we are able to store memories. It's the salts and minerals also, I think, that enable us to really store memories whilst in this physical body. And I think that the observer is observing all things. And so one of the things, and this is leading back to the whole topic of spirit in homeopathy. But one of the things that I have observed, because I've interviewed a lot of people that have had near-death experiences and spoken to a number of people that say that they can, for example, remote view, and who have had out-of-body experiences through various means. And so for the people, for example, who have had near-death experiences, and that even includes me, they have had an experience of feeling that they are rising And then they are looking down at their bodies being resuscitated. And 3 of them, and I've interviewed more than 3, they looked down and they said to themselves, I hope that person's going to be okay. They had no attachment whatsoever to the physical body anymore. Were not even aware that that was once them. And so they're in this observer mode. So they've become the observer in that moment. And what's interesting with that is that even in the regular realm of living here, we're able to observe ourselves. So how is it that, and including in dreams, we can observe some version of ourselves in a dream. We're the observer of our dreams. And people that say that they can have had out-of-body experiences. My son recently broke his wrist. And he's been in the wars this year, poor boy. But so he was skateboarding and he had to go to hospital, and they had to reset his arm. And the nurses had to hold his arm and yank it really hard to reset it. So they had to give him a drug called ketamine. And the doctor warned me he was going to be like, kind of awake, but not with us. And I watched this happen. And within 4 seconds, Rama was like, what the? And before his mouth was open, his eyes were bulging, and he was awake, but he was not with us. Afterwards, when he came around and everything, he was saying that he said it was so hard to explain, but he was watching from above the nurses resetting his arm, and he was like going through these wormholes and coming back out, and then watching them from a different angle and perspective. He could see me, all kinds of things. And so he was obviously having an out-of-body experience. So how is it that when and I say we live in 2 worlds, the one we live on and the one we live in. So the one we live in, everything that we experience in this body is experienced within the body. Our eyes are taking information in, taste is taking in, ears are taking in sound, touch is being felt through the body. What do we actually ever experience that is outside of the body? And so one of the things that we can do is observe ourselves. We can observe ourselves. So this is a very interesting aspect, because the observer is able to leave and be outside of the body, but also feel like it's inside of the body. In fact, sometimes it's more that it's outside of the body than inside of the body, because it's very difficult for us to observe our internal organs. It's easier for us to observe ourselves from the back of our head. And many, many people are actually able to agree with this and say, yes, I understand that kind of feeling of observing myself. So when I think about that aspect, I think about water again, and there's 2 types of water. And I think that there's the physical waters hydrating us, moving through us, constantly coming in, coming out. But then there is this spirit aspect, because when you're talking water, you're not just talking liquid. You're talking a liquid, solid, gas, a type of gel and plasma. You're talking about 2 feminine hydrogens and 1 large masculine oxygen. The feminine is rising and the masculine is in the mode of gravity. And so together they're in this beautiful balance, always looking for balance. And so when you're kind of looking at this aspect, then you start to think that, this idea of the observer might not be a liquid. It could be that if it is traveling in and out of the body, then it could be that there is the silver thread is really kind of a kind of evaporation of kinds. So just because the way in which we breathe, we're just breathing is making this vapor around us. And so the fact that there's vapor around us, the electrical charge that we give off creates this kind of web, and the water, evaporated water around us, is attracted to this web, and basically it gives us this kind of ability to. Sorry, my daughter's just making breakfast over there. It's okay, darling. And this ability to absorb information that's outside of us and share information about us. And so within that aspect, this kind of second type of spirit water, if you will, is able to be the observer. It's able to come and go from the body, but its tether is the electrical charge. And one of the reasons that people who have had near-death experiences have been able to come back into their bodies is because there is still a very weak electrical charge, even coming from the brain for up to 10 to 15 minutes after death. But even Dr. Gerald Pollack, who's become a dear friend of mine and mentor, he's told us that the fluids within the body can keep moving for an hour after death. And the fluid creates, any movement is going to create some weak kind of piezoelectricity, because we are not fresh water, we're salt water. And so this is all very interesting. But when you start to think about this concept that water could have something to do with spirit, then that applies also to plants and other kind of remedies. So bringing that back to homeopathy, what I'm thinking is that the more diluted the remedy is, diluted, the closer to spirit it becomes.
Ooh,
the less
yes.
worldly kind of bodily, again, tethers it has. So the further away, and of course, someone once said that death is like taking off an uncomfortable shoe. So it's kind of this idea that all of a sudden the spirit is actually growing rather than becoming smaller. And it's growing and growing and growing. And so that does make absolute sense that the impression it's giving into the water is only getting bigger.
Wow. There's so much in that. I love how you've just explored that. For many of my women, although my path is largely based around the lineage of homeopathic remedies, they may not actually know too much about it. But essentially, I think what you're speaking to there is very much about how water can also hold the energetic imprint of these remedies as well. And I think there's, I'm just feeling into what the question is that I have for you there. Interestingly, just before, I loved what you said about masculine and feminine. Just before we began talking, I was looking at water as an archetypal remedy or a homeopathic remedy in itself. And it's the whole description of it as a remedy. It said in the beginning there was water. It's life preserving. It's in the ocean. In fact, I've written down the quote. Here we go. So I had it. You're not a drop in the ocean. You're an ocean in the drop. You're a unique remedy. And it struck me because there was that, it kind of, I talk about remedies like having a shadow and gold. So like almost the shadow expression of water itself feels to be that it's like open, it's got this deep sensitivity, but it can also like merge into its environment and dissolve into others, which very much feels to me that kind of spirit thing you're talking about as well. And also this idea of like separation, but in the gold expression of water, which is like water in its healthy expression, and this is as an energetic remedy rather than the actual physical water, is that it's like very it's got that deep sense of union. And I really loved that it was when you talked about the masculine and feminine that then struck me as like, oh, interesting. Like it's there's something there about this deep sense of connection, flow, oneness that you're speaking to as well. So that was quite magical.
Well, if you would like, I think that this kind of is a very important topic about this kind of idea of water's ability to store information, and as water also as water as a remedy. Now, I don't know if you've seen any of my more latest work or been at any of my workshops, but one of the things I've been sharing lately is a very, very important piece to my work that I've been taught by my children and other children around the world. And it very much kind of, in some ways, relates to homeopathy, but not exactly. But it is 100% water, but using something that some people may describe as homeopathic-like. So years ago, when my daughter was a lot younger, I was doing my crystallographic process. So, for anybody that doesn't really know what I do, you may have described it already, but essentially, I also teach people how to do the work I do. So I've discovered that water communicates in 3 ways. There are what I call signature patterns, and this is within the realm of freezing water. So I freeze the water for a very short period of time, usually around 5 minutes. There's liquid on top and ice underneath. I tip the liquid away, and then I photograph the crystalline ice that's left behind. And those patterns might be a signature pattern. So tap water looks disordered. Spring water tends to form hexagons. Filtered water has these lines that specific, so it's gone through a filter. Rainwater looks like a fan. So they all have their patterns. The other way, we say that art is the heart of water. I have found that because I see the world through a very artistic lens, water likes to respond to me that way. So I tend to see that water reveals imagery that looks like the influence. So, for example, my cat Jiva was like looking at the water, and then I froze it using my short-term freezing method. And there, lo and behold, there's this amazing cat picture in the ice. And then, there's, like I said, 37,000 photos isn't random. And
I
so
have to say, if people haven't yet looked your work up, I think they really should, because it is fascinating. So,
and then people can understand the enthusiasm, because if the images were not clear, I don't know that I'd be even speaking to you. And so the third way is something called hydroglyphs, and that's been the last 4.5 years of my work. I recently spoke at the annual water conference in Germany, invited by Dr. Jerry Pollack, and I was the closing speaker at the banquet. And I talked about my work, and one of the things that I shared at the end was I gave 64 examples of several hydroglyphs. Now, a hydroglyph is different than art and different than a signature pattern. It's different because essentially it's a symbol in ice that is repeatable, identifiable, and is relative to meaning. So, for example, I might want to see the hydroglyph for creation. So what I'll do is I write it on a piece of paper, put my petri dish of water on top of it for 30 seconds. It's not too long, not too short. Then I'll freeze it using my technique. And then when I pull it out, there's a specific glyph for the creation, for the word creation. But water isn't reading words. Water absorbs the energy or spirit of words. And so this is a very important piece. And then I'll see that. So to say I have one hydroglyph, I have to have seen it repeat at least 50 times to say that it is one. And then I've discovered that they have layers of meaning. So the creation glyph also means fire. But then there are 4 different stages of melting and freezing of the creation glyph that actually include all the other elements. It's extremely complex. And we have, 36 hydroglyphs and their layers of meaning. And it takes me a long time, which is why I only have so few after such a long time. But the significance of them is really mind-blowing. So I've been invited to write a scientific paper on it, which I've been getting help to do. And I've already been offered for it to be published in 3 scientific journals. Jerry said this could be one of the most biggest kind of breakthroughs and findings this century, that water has
wow. Yes, I love that. Also having a language feels amazing. There's I love that you brought in fire there, because I often refer to my secret witches as like having this phosphoric fire. We work a lot with the archetypal apothecary remedy fire. So it's quite magical that came in for creation, because of course the witch is the ultimate creatrix as well. So that's a whole nother conversation. But There's
But
really something. Oh, so go on.
oh, sorry, but I do want to bring it back to what I was saying about children, because I
Oh,
think you'll
yes.
find interesting as a homeopath, and that so my daughter would sometimes, she would come to me, and when I was doing the crystallography, and she was like, oh, can I have that dish with the ice still frozen? And then she would start to eat it, and I was like, oh, what are you doing? And she was like, she was like, oh, something like, it's good for me, mummy. And I'm like, oh, okay. And then like a week or so later, her brother did the same thing separate to her. And occasionally they would do that. And I'm like, oh, I wonder if that's interesting. I'd notice patterns. That's what I do.
Mm.
So then I was sharing that with somebody who had been doing my work, and I taught her, and she's working alongside me, and she said that her children also did that. And then as I began to talk more and more to people that had learnt my technique, they're like, oh, our children do that too. So I've got this bunch of children around the world eating this crystallography. And I mean, the timing is different for each freezer and all of that. So I mean, I have to help people get the actual thing right. But once you know it, it's actually a very, very simple process. So then my husband, he was investigating plant medicines using words and my technique. So what was really interesting was that he already knew about what I just told you about the children. So he wanted to explore that as well. So for a whole week, Ryan was exploring the word ayahuasca, and he would write the word, do the process, everything. But afterwards, he would eat the ice. And after a week doing this, he said, I think I need to take this seriously, because he started to have some effects. And so
I love that.
I've begun to share this. Now I've had stories and reports back from people that have had terrible insomnia, that have now say they've been sleeping through the night. I've had people with depression saying that they're actually starting to feel much lighter. But on my last masterclass, which was just last weekend, I had a lady on to speak because she had some fairly serious vaccine related injuries. And she had healed herself with 6 months of using different words. You find the right word that comes out of the well of your own knowledge, and you write that, and you use that word. And for her, for a long time, her word was connection. And so she said even the water started to taste different as she started to heal. And she said it was really wonderful to listen to her speak, because she's the person that's done it the longest for 6 months. So where it will go, I don't know, but it is extremely powerful. And the fact that we were taught it by children, I think, is very important.
That's so beautiful and so magical and in alignment with the work that we do. It feels like it's profound in terms of like its recognition of how homeopathy can have an impact in that, like, we can see that if the water that these remedies are diluted in can have that sort of impact, like it's kind of making sense of all of that. And it's interesting for me personally, because the way that I work with remedies is no longer by prescribing remedies themselves, but by bringing the essence and the energy of that particular remedy alive. So I love that on 2 levels. Like, one, that it's speaking directly to homeopathy, which is kind of my lineage, and the way that I'm kind of almost uniquely working with these remedies and bringing them alive as an essence, and like dosing them into my circles in the way that I work with women. It speaks to that as well, because it speaks to the fact that we're working with energy here. And yeah, I love that story about the ayahuasca. And as you were telling it, I was like, oh, that was a brave remedy to pick.
He's a very brave man, but, but like, ultimately fearless and curious, and one of the many qualities that I love about him. But, I think that where that can go is really only left to the imagination. But what I love and what I really want to add is that unlike the work that Nikola Tesla did and Victor Schauberger did, who were both absolute geniuses, their work towards the end of their life sadly was taken and used for other purposes that were not what they had intended it for, or taken away from them. And what's great about working in this field with water is that water will not work in the energy of frustration and anger. It doesn't design. It won't design. And so it's not a judgment. And there's no judgment from water. It just doesn't resonate at that frequency. So for anyone to go and take it and go, I'm going to create some, bad this or whatever, although again, that's just such polarities. Water's always trying to remind me to sort of take all these labels away. But there is ability. For example, I'm just going to give you an example. Someone, can you manipulate water, like mentally? Could you tell it one thing and really mean another? And so there was a point years ago when I was open to trying these things, and now it just feels like not nice to do, so I don't tend to do it. But I do remember a time where I was kind of like saying to water, or thinking about it to water, I was like, well, just give me this one beautiful picture, and it's just going to be between you and me. I won't share it or anything like that. I was outwardly kind of mentally just saying that, but inwardly knowing that I would share it on social media and thousands of people probably see it. And so and I'm like, this isn't really in my nature to say one thing and do another. So it felt really weird, and that also would have been in my energy field. The water just wasn't having it. It just didn't play with me at all. It just didn't design. And so
fascinating.
Very, very interesting. So it's always a relief to me, because this could be, one of the most powerful modalities. And yet it's only really designed to be in a higher vibrational mode. So it's also interesting when you start to see what's showing up, and even in our movies right now. I just went to see Avatar, and such a big part of that was all about water. It was the way of the water. I went to see Wakanda. I clearly have children, and Wakanda was all about people living in the ocean, the mermaids and these kind of mer people living in the ocean. What's it called? Frozen 2 talks about water storing and holding information, and even there's a scene in one of the I can't remember which movie it is, where Batman's talking to Aquaman. And he says, so Aquaman, I hear you can talk to fish. And Aquaman says something like, no, I talk to the water, and the water talks to the fish. And so, you start hearing these things coming through, and it's like, there's something in the water. There's a new wave of change beginning to happen, and it's time.
Yeah, it's so powerful. It speaks to me of one of my favorite quotes is by a woman called Lisa Lister, who says every word we speak is a spell. It also speaks to me of that, and it's kind of, the interesting part about that is, like you say, that the piece about it not kind of resonating with the destructive kind of force. I'm really curious about that. Also, what I'm curious about when you're talking about that is, I loved the quote on your website as well. I think you said something like, water is the rebel element. It won't conform to the laws of physics or gravity, and it can't be killed. Without it, there is no life. It reincarnates for all to see, and science tells us it came to Earth from outer space. Rebellious, nonconformist, eternal, and alien. Just look at the power we are filled with. I wondered if you've got anything to speak to on that, because I kind of loved that quote.
Well, that's kind of speaking also from facts. You just have a look at the facts about water. Now, what I will add in there as a little caveat, though, is that some scientists believe that water came from meteorites and asteroids. most scientists now believe that actually water originated from inside the Earth's mantle, and some of it was seeded by asteroids and meteorites. Now, this water inside the Earth's mantle is called primary water, and it's held within the ringwoodite crystals in the Earth's crust, in the Earth's mantle. And there's more water there than there is on the surface of Earth, and it's drinkable. So it's interesting because on the very few times that I've posted about it, or others have posted about primary water, it's without question removed on social media. And so I always tend to have a little look and go, I wonder why it is that someone out there doesn't want that out there. Because the same thing happened to me when I shared what happened to water when you exposed it to 5G. And so when I see that when there is scarcity or a scarcity mindset, there is value and money to be made. And so if the idea was that we're running out of water, everybody then is going to be willing to pay a great deal of money for water. And then water becomes a commodity, of which it already is. And if you consider, again, reiterating, by molecular count, we're 99% water, we are selling ourselves and bottling and selling ourselves and an essence of ourselves. And we're buying each other rather than it being free-flowing and something of which is life-giving and honored and sacred. In our old wisdom, even our language was different. Water wasn't called water. It was called the waters, seen as body of sacred water.
No, I love that. I love the sacred honoring of water. You've just reminded me, speaking about honoring, we were just talking before we pressed record around your ancestors, and I wondered if you could share something around that, because that feels like that'd be really juicy for our women to hear about.
Of course. A while ago, I was really thinking into what my ancestors on my mother's side life must have been like, because there were a number of them that were literally burnt at the stake for being witches. And I know from just through handed down information more so, but one of them was a midwife. And the idea that that just to be a midwife to help somebody give birth was considered to be a witch. It just seemed absolutely insane to me. And so I was feeling into what that must have felt like to be that little bit different as well, to actually in a time where it was you could be, if you couldn't recite the Bible, for example, on the spot eloquently, then you were considered a witch. If you didn't have children, you're a witch. If your milk curdled, you could be a witch. If you were rich, if you were poor, if you were not married, if you were outspoken, you can't win. If you were old, if you were wrinkly, if you had a birthmark, these were all genuine reasons to think that you were what was termed a witch, which was someone who was working in the supernatural and was going to somehow put some black voodoo on you, and they were the devil's work, which is so sad to me. And when I felt into what that must have been like back then, how could you feel free to express who you really are? Just an outspoken rich woman. My God. And that's even not okay. It's not okay. Just all of these different kind of things. And so many women were killed. And even if you had epilepsy or anything, that was grounds for murder. It's insane. And so I was thinking about my ancestors and projected the thought of them into the water. And it's on my social media pages if people want to go through. But you can see this beautiful face that is very, very clear in the ice. And interestingly, though, when I showed it to a family member who was married into the family, she said, "Oh, it looks like a witch." I'm like, "Oh, really? So what does a witch look like?" And it felt like, oh, because the image had a more pronounced nose. And I mean, my mother had a pronounced nose, and I think that came through her family line. I had more inherited my father's nose, but still, it's like, oh, so we have this idea of what a witch is, and is meant to be like long nose and pointy chin and warts and stuff and all of this. And like, why are we still even holding that idea of what that is? But of course, that comes through in the fairy stories. It comes through from a young age of like this concept and idea of witches. And so, having had that happen, I'm like, oh, it's definitely time for a little bit. And even I've been called one. I remember I was, this was years ago before I even really started doing a lot of this stuff with water. I had a wellness center and I was doing a lot of healing work. And I guess I had some kind of abilities. And I remember this lady, she said to me, "Oh, she goes, you're such a witch. You're such a witchy witch. And I'm just like, some part of me was so triggered by that. And
I love that you share that, because often women, even though they could be drawn into that kind of archetype, which is what we essentially are working with when we talk about the witch, and like she's a powerful story for us to like hold up a mirror and be like, oh, that's me. So I love that you're sharing that and how triggering that was. And I also, just as you were speaking there, it was just like had this real sense of like how proud your ancestors would be of the work that you're doing, because it very much feels to me, and the whole all of my work is really essentially about us discovering and becoming our unique remedy. And that tends to be like people who are in this path are medicine women, and it very much feels like, although you're saying I used to be like into wellness, it very much to me feels like water is your unique remedy. That's like what you were born here to express into the world. So it's always like that in itself is healing, therefore you are a witch in my mind.
Well, I appreciate that. And I think the healing just keeps expanding. You can, I think you're always a healer from the moment, when you're born. And actually it's interesting because I talk quite a bit about this kind of connection and this love aspect. I talk about when two people meet each other, sometimes we have that instantaneous, oh, you feel so familiar, like I feel like I know you. Or sometimes it's an immediate repelling kind of like, oh no. Or sometimes it's that concept we term as love at first sight. It's like, why is it though that we have this kind of feeling? And so one of the things I talk about in my masterclasses is these kind of webs, these energetic webs that I just talked about around from the electrical charge. And that's always slightly different for each person. But the energetic charge is really how heart-centered you are, really how much energy is coming out and to how far that web can really go. And that kind of invisible water that's in the air that we don't even think about is attracted to it. And we have this web. Well, if our webs look basically very, very similar or the same, there's an immediate attraction, immediate kind of energetic recognition that feels like family or feels like love. And
there's something in that around, like one of the basic foundational principles of homeopathy and the work that I do is that like cures like, and that very much speaks to like and again, this is why when we do the work to distill what our unique remedy is, it's probably why you and I are having this conversation. Our webs are probably very similar in that like I'm here as my medicine is homeopathy and your medicine is water, so therefore like our like cures like is like exactly that. It's like we're being drawn together to have this conversation, but it feels that way to me. It's like when we discover what our unique remedy is, i.e., which of the energies we were born as to live out in the world, that's how we are then able to heal both ourselves but also others. So yeah, I interrupted you there just because I heard that. So carry on what you were exploring. But
you're absolutely right. But also I kind of tend to dive into areas that include bodily fluids, like the spinal fluid. And there's a doctor I recently interviewed by the name, his name is Dr. Mauro Zapatera. He is a Harvard doctor, medical doctor, but he's also quite openly saying that he believes that the spinal fluid is the portal to cosmic consciousness, and that it's 99% water, spinal fluid, and it's moving and bathing our brains. And it's interesting because he talks about the way in which it's inside the brain, but also our brain is bathed in this fluid, and that fluid, when we're sleeping, moves, and it moves like the ocean, kind of like going in and out and in and out. So we have this ocean within us. And so what's interesting is then that dives into and leads into this kind of idea of the Kundalini moving up through the spinal fluid and entering into what they might term as Brahma's cave or the golden bowl, which then leads down into what's called Amrit, this dripping that comes through into eventually through the throat into the mouth. And it's very, very through the kind of area just into the roof of the mouth. It kind of drips down at the back, and it's called Amrit, which has been talked about in ancient Hindu texts and various other texts for such a long time. And so we're creating a unique type of water that's coming from the spinal fluid. And he even talked about one of the ideas and concepts that some Buddhists or Tibetan Buddhists have, where they do a lot of preparation for the way that they die. And he said that one of the ways that that someone has achieved has kind of become the Buddha, is that there is a little drop of spinal fluid that starts to actually come out of the head where the fontanelle is upon death.
Oh my goodness, that's fascinating. Wow.
Yeah, it's interesting when you start going deep into observations that people have had and from all around the world around water and bodily fluids as well, because we are our own ocean. And, we're kind of like in the shape of a human. But someone once said to me, what if water is expressing its consciousness through us and every living thing to observe itself from every perceivable and imperceivable perspective?
Well, that's mind-blowing. Very mind-blowing. I love that. Thank you for sharing that. We had a question from the group, specifically around healing. So I'm wondering if that might be a good time to come to that. This question said, I am assuming Veda's work was inspired by Masaru Emoto, where we can see how water responds to emotion. We can use that knowledge to heal by being aware of how we speak to the water within ourselves and the water we consume. I'm curious how she uses the images she captures for healing.
Mm-hmm. I think some of that was there's various ways to look at that. And this is a big topic for me, especially with the reference to Emoto. So I might address that one first. Yes, there was some inspiration from Emoto, mainly because he was one of the only people showing the crystallography. However, what he did was show things very, very much in contrast. And life is yes, we see the world sometimes and we learn a lot through contrasts, but life is not just black and white. It is so much gray. And one of the ways in which I really found that working with children, it reminds us of the way in which we present things. So I am often put together and talked about in the same breath as a motto, and saying that, be careful of what you say, be careful of what you think, water's listening, or, it's like, it's so sensitive, it can change just like that. And I work a lot with children, and I go into schools and I teach a mix of art and science and sort of consciousness in a way. And I have children, and I also have lots of other people talk to me that have children. And one of the things that we need to be, well, we don't need to be anything, that I tend to be very mindful of, is that when you say that, it creates more fear in a world of so much fear already. If we're afraid to say one bad thing, and now the water's going to destructure and denature, and it's just going to all fall apart, then that is a very scary thing for kids. And then they get afraid of so many things. So one of the reasons that I started and work with hydroglyphs was because my oldest son had seen Emoto's work where he used classical music and compared it to heavy metal. And it suggests that water doesn't like heavy metal. But why is it that we live in a world of billions of people, and there are many people in the world that are bodies of water just like us that like heavy metal? Is it that water doesn't like heavy metal? Or is it that the person that did that test didn't like heavy metal? What I've observed of water is that it is never in judgment. We are all designed perfectly with our own choices. Or just because somebody likes this or somebody likes that, and maybe they don't like what the other person likes, doesn't mean that it's wrong or that it's right. It's just they have a preference.
I love this. There's something about, like, it's just expressing. Like, we're kind of the ones putting the judgment on the water. Like, water is just expressing what's showing up.
In its most spiritual aspect, like I said, it's more of an observer. It is very, very balanced. And so balance can't come with judgment. And so what I actually did was that he said to me, my son said to me, well, I think the water must hate me. And I'm like, no, why? And he said, because I don't really like classical music, and I don't really like heavy metal. I actually like rap, and rap's more like heavy metal than it is to classical music. So therefore, water hates me. And I'm like, no, that is not the way it is. I said, water doesn't hate you, and it's not doing what you think it does. Water is responding to a couple of things. It's responding to the sounds and the frequency and the vibrations of the sound of the music, but it's also responding to how you feel about the music. So if you want to listen to Tupac and get your rap on, then you just go for it if that's what makes you happy. Because we know that our music taste tends to change and wave and move as we get older, as we change too. Nothing sort of stays the same. And that's the aspect of water I love, it that it's always finding its way back to source. And so it's really interesting because water is also source. So even on its way back to what we might term as the ocean of source, it already is a tributary of another pure part of source. So we've already found ourselves, but at the same time, we're always looking for new aspects of ourselves. It's very, very complex and interesting. But when I saw that with my son, so then I started taking photos of water after it exposed to all different kinds of genres of music, all the grays in between, And I'm like, oh, and he started to see, oh, water loves to respond to words in music. So it's interesting because a lot of heavy metal, even if it might just be some roaring sound, well, it might have a word in there that water will pick up on. And the words don't necessarily, it's all not just like terrible words. Some heavy metal actually tends to have the word love in it. It tends to have various different things. Not all of them are like whatever. And it's interesting because the hydroglyph for living and gratitude. Those are the two most common meanings. Like I said, hairdroggers have layers of meaning. We've also discovered through this man who told me he only had a few months to live, and he said, could you please see what water says about death? So when I wrote the word death, I kept seeing the same glyph as living. And I did it over and over and over again. I'm like, this can't be right. And then I'm realizing, of course it's right, because water doesn't die. Water is always in one of its stages. We label it as dead water if it's polluted or we think it's destructured or denatured. But actually, it will always evaporate into one of its other stages. So water, from water's perspective, death is simply another word for life. It is not, it is just a transition. And so even within these aspects, it's like I feel literally, I've been studying water for so long and I feel like I know nothing half the time. What I do know is that there is so much I don't know, but the little I know is like such nectar. And I think that we've gone into this idea, yes, that thoughts become things. We can manifest things. And if we are having a pattern of thought, that's one thing. But if you just have a thought that comes into your head during the day and you're having a good day, and then all of a sudden you're listening to the radio and it's all doom and gloom, and then you start kind of thinking, oh God, the state of the world, or whatever you're thinking, that doesn't mean that that the rest of your day needs to be ruined, or that the water within you is just kind of turning to custard, so to speak, as my father might say. It actually really means that you've had a thought come in, but we are not our thoughts. Thoughts are really like clouds, but they're always moving, going by. Sometimes they get big and heavy, but when they do that, that's because they need to rain. But we're really the sky, and we're able to observe our thoughts. And so I think that water is far, and not just think. Sorry, my daughter's just getting something out of the cupboard. It's a bit crunchy sounding, but the water is really more interested in what we're feeling than what we're thinking. And I have seen
I love that.
over and over again. So some people might think that, oh, I'm feeling really sad, I shouldn't do any work with water today. And the only time where I've found that water won't work with me is if I'm angry or frustrated. But if I'm sad, and I share this in my masterclasses, if I'm sad, even without trying to project my feeling into water, I'm working with water and I'm showing it some image or doing something, but ultimately I've just had a really hard day, I'm feeling sad. Water won't go from and I often use spring water for my work. So we'll take that spring water, and I know what its signature pattern is. Its signature pattern is a hexagon. So some people might think, oh, your sadness is going to like denature or make it so that water looks like more, not so ordered. But actually the water took my emotion and mirrored me and created these sad faces more than twice. And what I'm seeing is that water is simply reflecting my emotions. It's not interested in what I'm showing it. It's not interested in the picture. People think, oh, it's always just your consciousness that water is picking up on. It's not just your your mental expression. It's far more interested in what you've been thinking about. I have a lady who works alongside me from Slovenia. And for 6 months, she was using my technique before she knew anything about hydroglyphs. And and I didn't know this story, but then she was one of the first people to join my private Facebook group for people that are actively using my technique. And she started to share these images. So she shared these pictures of her 2 dogs. And I'm like, wow, they're amazing, like in the ice. And I reached out to her. And I said, you must have this amazing relationship with water because the imagery is so great. And she said, no, 6 months, water didn't speak to me. Water didn't like me. I was for 6 months, I didn't get anything. I'm like, and you kept going for 6 months? And she said it ended up being like a meditation for her. She let go of the outcome. But what was really important and interesting to know is that I said, well, have a look at my hydroglyph PDF, which is the symbols I told you about, and maybe go through the rest of your work and tell me what you see. So what was interesting is that when she did that, she came back to me. She said, I found that water was talking to me all along. I didn't realize there was this other kind of communication, and I can now see how supported and how incredibly, intelligent and sympathetic water was to me. But what was interesting is that she was showing the water images of tulips, but all she'd been worried about her dogs. One dog, her dog that was alive, she'd lost another dog that was a whippet, but she had an Afghan that was still alive, an Afghan dog. And the dog had been sick all week. So even though she was doing the crystallography and she was showing the tulips, water designed both her dogs. Sorry, going over there, but it was like, and you could clearly see that they were the breed of dog that they were in the ice. So
that's amazing.
The little one was the whippet that was sitting on top of the big Afghan's head, and so it's very, very powerful. And that's why I'm magical. Saying, again, you don't have to even be in the happiest of moods. You don't have to. It's a family. It's a relationship. It's a kind of bonding. I would say that you might find this interesting, and your listeners might find it interesting. I was a little nervous to share about it on the workshop when I was in Germany at the conference, because it was a whole bunch of scientists and physicists and biologists, but I was called to share it anyway. So a while ago, years ago now actually, I was talking to an Indigenous woman who shared that she could speak to and communicate with bees. She said she'd watched their hive for long periods of time. And one bee eventually came out and communicated to her and said, we don't mind you looking at our hive, but please don't look at it for too long, because your conscious expression is putting too much light in the hive, and we like it to be darker. And that was such an important piece to me, because I've photographed, not often can I catch this, but every now and then, as water's just beginning to freeze, it sends these little sort of like seeker shoots out, and the ice just starts to form these little icicles before it really designs. And around those shoots, I've photographed what looks like an aura. And so water is actually mostly photons, which means it's mostly light, it's liquid light. And even if you look at oxygen and hydrogen, these gases, right? So it's interesting, because what I see is that actually it is light that paves the way for the design of the crystallography in the ice. And that the more your conscious expression is focused into the water, the more water is able to receive that. And so there is this bond that happens, this kind of emotional bond, which is a very real thing. We know what that's like when we have children. We have an emotional bond to them. We can sense when there's something wrong, even if they live on the other side of the world. Our dogs have the same thing. Rupert Sheldrake did this study where he was able to film dogs and in the house, and their owner was taken away by the film crew, and there was a camera on the dog. It was sort of just lying there. And at the moment that the owner was told that they were going to go home now, the dog stood up and went to the door. And they did the same experiment with lots of dogs and their owners. So there's an intuitive knowing and bonding. Same thing with water. It's water bonded to other bodies of water. And so it is interesting when you start kind of going down that route about this idea of connection and what is it that connects us. I say to children, and when I go into the schools, if your skin was invisible and your organs were see-through, what would you look like, and how would you recognize your parents? Now, all the children always end up coming back to the fact that we look like streams and waterfalls. One boy said that he'd look like a brain-shaped cloud with electrical rain coming down in the shape of a human. But
Mm.
but when it comes to how would you recognize your parents, they being kind of like these moving liquid like jellyfish with bones, they said, oh, well, I'd recognize her by the way she smells. I'd recognize him by the way he sounds. I'd recognize their energy.
Mm.
So it's very, very interesting, because really that's kind of what we're doing without really realizing it. Because, there was a time in my life when I had to have eye surgery, and actually was real concerns that I wouldn't be able to see. I even started learning Braille when I was young. And I realized that actually the way we see the world so much more from the way we feel the world, and that we might care to admit.
It's gorgeous.
And that when you can't see, you experience in a different way. So I always think it's quite powerful to actually try to do that, even if it's just for a few minutes in your waking state. Even that's why drawing with your eyes closed is a very powerful therapy, because you get to see that, a whole different aspect of the way you draw, the way you write, the way you kind of experience the world. It's like doing a picture with your eyes closed is a very, very powerful thing to do. So because water is flowing all the way through us. It's on all the caverns of our body. It's like this deep underwater ocean that is like moving freely and going through all of the different cavities and going through the capillaries, going all the way through our body and also exiting our body. So I have done lots of studies on different bodily fluids, and I've discovered that even when you spit into a petri dish after speaking a word, there will be often some reference of that last word in the saliva. And that tends to lend into like praying or blessing our food or water before we speak, before we eat, or before we drink. And
is that a way that you would recommend people work with water for healing?
Well, I actually think that working in this crystallographic method, it's very, very simple, where you're able to use words or whatever modality you want, and then freeze the water to that liquid crystal state, because that's a fourth phase of water. So you're talking about actual healing. Fourth phase water is the best type of water to drink. It's more of a plasma. It has negative charge, which is a very important piece. So you can eat your water by eating things like cucumber and watermelon and aloe vera and these kinds of things, where the plant has actually already made a plasma. But water in this icy state is even more informed. So the difference between blessing the water in its liquid state compared to eating the ice in its liquid crystal state is that water in its liquid state is updating its information every trillionth of a second. It is constant chaos. I call it chaos because molecularly it really is. But as water begins to slow down and freeze, but before it's frozen, before it's a solid, it's actually taken information and crystallized it. And what we're actually then able to do is eat it in the eating the spirit or eating the energy of it. Now we're being told, the ice caps are melting and we're doing all this kind of stuff, and it's all the morphia here. But actually, in water in its freezing state and in its melting state, they're fourth phase stages. Water as it's melting is also fourth phase water. This is an incredibly potent.
I'm loving that. I'm also just thinking back to the card that I pulled, which was snow, and it's just feeling so magically perfect. So the healing is in the snow. That is so magical. Yeah, in the ice. And Yeah, it's funny. When I was training as a homeopath many years ago, if we didn't have the remedy, we would be trained that if you just put the name of the remedy under a glass of water, that would infuse the water with the energy. So this completely makes perfect sense to me. So in terms of like a healing method, like that's actually a really exciting way for my women to also work with their unique remedies, is they're distilling what those are and yeah, being able to dose themselves with it, because I'm all about people being able to heal themselves and become their own self-healer. That feels super powerful. So I'm really, really glad and excited that you shared that. Actually, that feels very perfect.
Thank you. Well, I've also done a whole study on homeopathy and put the a drop into we are seeing that the imagery looks very, very similar to the original plant.
Yes,
and
I saw that. Yeah.
which are encouraging. But I've done a similar thing where I've put a glass of water, and I guess we kind of need to end soon. We've been talking for a little while. But where I've taken a glass of tap water, which has a very specific signature pattern, and I've put it next to really beautiful, beautifully structured. And by structured, I'm not saying, oh, it's such a blanket statement, my water's structured, everyone thinks it looks like Emoto's crystals. But actually knowing how volatile the stage of liquid is, it's interesting to kind of like, really, one of the ways you really know what you're looking at is through either the ways that people like Jerry Pollock are able to see if the water has this fourth phase water. It becomes like a liquid battery, or using something like my technique where you can actually see what the crystallography looks like. But so if you put like a tap water next to spring water and you leave it overnight, what is interesting is that the tap water changes its signature pattern into look much more like rainwater. So it's upgraded, it's improved significantly, it's opened up to look more like a fanning pattern. But the spring water also improves. The spring water that I've seen, it had the hydroglyph which is a lotus, which means purity, enlightenment. So it added another lotus to that lotus, and that shape became a heart, which means love in hydroglyphs, which means essentially then loving purity. And so it's very interesting. But one of the most shared studies I did was on egg albumin relative to this. And I observed, and I've done this now for, 4.5 years, 5 years, where I found, I was always interested thinking, what would be the most informed naturally? What water would be the most informed? And I always thought outside of the sea, it would have to be amniotic fluid. And because I can't have easy access to amniotic fluid, I thought the next best thing would be to look at eggs. So I discovered that there are two parts, just like there's two types of water, I think, are in people. There are two types of water in egg white, the gloopy gelatinous part and the thinner part that it runs out, that's a lot more like kind of runny saliva. Now, when you freeze that thinner part, what I've observed is that from very fresh, free range bird eggs, I'm talking chickens, I'm talking ducks, quails, and geese, there are 6 identified patterns that occur. 4 of those patterns I term as complex. 2 of them are more rudimentary. When you freeze the same albumin from caged hen eggs, they can maximum only create the 2 rudimentary patterns. Now, what I did was originally I put one free-range egg next to a caged hen egg, all from the free-range eggs were from the same batch, the caged hen eggs were from the same batch. So I already had done controls, I knew what they looked like. So I put one next to the other and I left them overnight. What was so interesting, this was the very first test I did was that the free-range egg stayed exactly the same, but the caged hen egg actually improved and had more like 4 complex, 2 rudimentary patterns and 2 complex patterns. So it had actually improved significantly. So, and I shared it on social media. Everyone was like, oh, yeah. But what if you surround it by bad eggs? Surely that'll make it go bad. So I did that, and I've done that twice. I put a caged head, I put a free-range hen egg in the middle, and I surrounded it by caged hen eggs. I took control sort of either one and left them overnight. And in the morning, in the center, I tested for the free-range egg, and it still looked as beautiful as ever. But there was healing by proximity, where the eggs that were the closest to the free-range egg had all improved to such a degree I couldn't differentiate them from free-range. But the ones that were further out had still improved, but were not as significantly improved as the ones the closest to the free-range egg. And now I've repeated that, and I've seen exactly the same results. So what this is really saying, if you put into terms of humans, is that if you heal yourself, you heal others. It's why we're so attracted to certain people. It's why, there is a healing that is happening just by being around somebody who has really got a beautiful, loving energy and who has healed themselves. So it's very, very powerful to really feel into that. And this is on a very primordial level. We have this understanding, or this concept. I don't know if it's an understanding. We have these concepts. We get quite cynical sometimes when we get older, because we see that the world isn't maybe what we thought it was when we were children. And so that can make us feel a little bit despondent. But actually, in those primordial level, which we're really looking in the egg, it makes more sense in nature, that nature improve rather than degrade, because we see in nature that the weakest don't tend to do that well. So this happens with both fertilized eggs and unfertilized eggs. So even in the unfertilized eggs, there is this fluid potential for life. So it's very, very interesting. It's always, there is this, I believe that the highest vibration and spiritual aspect to water is it is actually there to upgrade and improve everything.
That's magical. That is so, and I loved that piece about as we heal ourselves, like that will ripple out into others, into the collective. That's so much a part of this is essentially, you've just summed up the reason why I do the work that I do. So yeah,
I remember my spiritual teacher in India. He said to me, there have been some of the greatest saints and sages and regular people who have the most beautiful open hearts. He said, it's like they are vessels of divine love. And he said that those people will spontaneously heal people from all around the world, from not everybody, but certain people, wherever their energy reaches. And they might never meet them. They will reach people around the world that they will never meet, because that energy spreads so far, so wide, that it is actually, and it's so long resonant, that it will heal people that they will never meet, and they will never know why they healed so well or so quickly, but they were open and resonant to that energy at the time. And I think it's very, very, very more powerful than we really understand, how it is to really just begin on working on ourselves. And that can so often, sadly, just learning to be kind to ourselves. And one of the ways, because we can be so nice to other people and say all the nice things, but we don't apply that to ourselves. And I'm not immune to that. And one of the for me personally, I'm married to someone 20 years younger than me. And I swore I would never be involved with someone younger than me, because I thought, what could they possibly have in common, and what would you talk about? But clearly I was so wrong. And within that he has been this kind of mirror for me. And within that, I am also realizing that one of the greatest struggles that sometimes I deal with is that being the older person, especially as a woman, it's kind of like, you have to really like yourself, because there's always younger, beautiful women in the world. There's always someone more this and more that and more this and more that. And it's like, am I good enough? Am I pretty enough? Am I this enough? Is he going to not love me if I start getting more wrinkles? Am I going to do this and that? And it's like, we never got together for any of those reasons. The reason we got together was because there was this deep, like, knowing, this deep love, which doesn't come with all the fears. When I met him, I wasn't worried about any of that stuff. And when he met me, neither one of us were looking for each other knowingly. But it's interesting, because in the times where water is showing me, and water is always, it's like these little petri dishes of reflections, some part of ourselves. And so it's this part of me where I'm seeing things that's so beautiful, and I can see all this beauty. And yet in the same breath, sometimes I can feel so bad about myself. And then I think about it, and there's this little analogy, which I feel is very powerful. And that is when, if you imagine that someone very, very dear to you, who has passed away, gave you a seed, something that was this special seed that was really special to them. And one of their last wishes was that you plant it. And so you planted this seed with lots of love and care, and you put it into like a little pot of perfect, beautiful soil, and you water it and you give it light, and all of a sudden it starts to come up, and oh my gosh, it's this pretty beautiful little like seedling, and it starts to grow, and it's starting to look more and more beautiful and radiant. And you keep giving it light, and you keep giving it love, and you keep giving it warmth, and all of whatever it needs. And then there's this point, and that's us, we are that seed. But what we're doing, and what we do and I see so common, this thread, is that the equivalent of saying to that seed, you are not enough, you're not good enough, you're not beautiful, you don't look like the other plants somehow, you're different. That's the equivalent of what we are doing to ourselves. If we took photo of ourselves as a 4-year-old or a 3-year-old and tried telling that child what we tell ourselves now, we would not be able to do it. So why is it okay that we do it now?
Yeah, I think that's something that our women will so resonate with. And I just got this image of us like eating ice with like love, frozen love.
No, and that is it. I mean, water is this, for me, it is a spiritual teacher, of which is truly loving, and kind and compassionate, and ultimately reflecting the way it sees us, but not always the way we see ourselves. Because I feel that as much as it picks up on our thoughts and our feelings, it has its own purpose. It also has its own voice, because water doesn't always do what I want it to. Often it doesn't. Water is wild. You see all these images and things, and that's because water wants to do that. It's not because the moment I try to make water do anything, it won't play with me.
It brings us back actually magically to the snow, because this card said like each crystal is its own unique expression. I think that's just the perfect place to complete, because that's all essentially what this work with the witch is all about, like us fully expressing ourselves. So yeah, it's just been such a magical conversation. Thank you so much. Yeah, I would love for people, before we do complete, just to know where they can hear more about you and like go and dive into your work, because it is so magical, and I know they'll all be wanting to know more.
Yeah, sure. I post daily on Instagram and Facebook. So Instagram is Veda Austin _water. And on Facebook, it's Veda Austin @water researcher. And my website is vedaaustin.com. And people can get the step-by-step guide on PDF guide, or they can hop on one of my beginners workshops. I keep them small, so I help people in real time. We'll get their freezer settings right. We look at their ice imagery. It's actually really lovely. And then I have my master classes, which the last one was 8 hours long. I share every study I've ever done. Amazingly inspirational people to come and speak as well. So yeah, they're I don't do them often, but when I do, I put everything into them.
Oh, that's so yeah, I'm going to be looking at that myself. I'm going to be freezing all the remedy essences and seeing what, actually, I'd love to do that. That's such a good idea for the remedies that I dose in this path, seeing what that reveals. Yes. Well, thank you so much. I'll put all of that information about where people can find you in the show notes as well. So so people can have a little look. But yeah, thank you so much for being with us and sharing all of your wisdom. The work that you're doing is just so special. So yeah,
it's my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
No, it's our pleasure. What an in-depth show with Veda. Here are some of my key takeaways. We are 99% water, which means there are more water molecules in our bodies than there are stars in the Milky Way. When we cry, cut ourselves, go to the bathroom, exercise, we leak. In essence, we're fluid, but we look in the mirror with our fourth phase 99% liquid crystal eye lenses and we see our bodies as solid. If eyes are the windows to the soul, then tears are an expression of spirit. We can engage in relationship to the spirit of water for deep healing. The spirit of water is able to be the observer and come and go from the body, but its tether is the electrical charge. And one of the reasons that people who have had near-death experiences have been able to come back to their bodies is because there is a very weak electrical charge coming from the brain for 10 to 15 minutes after death. If we think about this fact that water has something to do with spirit, then that applies to plants and other kind of remedies. And when something is diluted, the closer to spirit it becomes. This makes sense of energetic remedies like homeopathy. We're essentially invoking the spirits of the remedies, which is the lineage of this path, and water can demonstrate the spirits of these remedies in its crystallized form. Water is hungry for information and will observe it and show you. Water itself is a remedy, and given that it observes the energy of things, when we crystallize energies in water, they can also be consumed in ice to have healing effects. Spinal fluid is the portal to cosmic consciousness. When we sleep, our brain is bathed in this fluid that moves like the ocean in and out. In essence, we have an ocean within us, which reminds me of the quote, "You are not a drop in the ocean, you are an ocean in a drop," by Rumi. Water responds to us, and we can play with it by using Veda's technique. More details are in the show notes as to how to find her work. If you'd like to get the show notes and links for everything we've chatted about in this episode, head to www.secretwitch.co.uk. If you know a secret witch who would love this episode, please share with them to help them liberate themselves. And so you don't miss out on next week's episode, head to your podcast app of choice and hit subscribe. Thank you so much for listening. I'll see you next time.